Hello, everybody. My name is Vladimir Jarasek. I'm the Director of Events of Cloud Security Alliance. Today, we have a great guest from Cloud Security Alliance over in Canada. Sean will be talking about top threats to cloud computing. Without further ado, because we have a little bit limited time, and I probably realize those watching might be eating dinner. I'll hand over to Sean. Sean won't be doing the camera for some technical difficulties, but we'll have a great slide deck. So, Sean, over to you, and I will put your slides on full screen. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vladimir. And thank you, everyone, for being here and having me. It is definitely a pleasure. My name is Sean Heidi. I am the Research Technical Director at Cloud Security Alliance. Previously, I was in charge of our Enterprise Architecture Working Group, which is a overall architecture that maps to the CCM. I'm in charge of our Top Threats Working Group, which, of course, we are going over today, where we have a semi-annual survey that goes out on the current breaches in our space. I'm also in charge of our intelligence sharing platform, which will be launching in the near future for CSA. But I'm here today to talk about our top threats to cloud computing document. Today, we will be going over briefly what the document is and then moving into the deep dive of the previous Egregious 11. I would like to say we do have a new survey coming out. That launch will be at RSA this year, actually in exactly a little under a month on June 6th. That will be releasing, so be on the lookout for that. We've initiated some new research on the top breaches over the last 2 years through COVID. It's been a wild ride. I hope everyone's been safe, and we will go over briefly what our findings have been for that new survey and give you a glimpse of what to expect. So our agenda for today, we are going to be going over the purpose of the Top Threats survey report, and then later on moving into the deep dive. I want to explain to everyone how we identify the threats for these survey reports, which feeds into our deep dive analysis for security, how to utilize those findings. Then, like I said, moving into the deep dive itself, I will be going over two of our previous findings, two of the use cases we had gone over in prior years. Today, we probably will not have any details on threat modeling or time to go over those, but I would like to briefly just touch on, as we build out these annual surveys for top threats, as we build out these deep dives, the working group itself for top threats is initializing tabletop threat exercising, which brings into force threat modeling and how to do it. So when we look at all of these findings we have for breaches, we're going to take these use cases and feed them into threat modeling exercises for volunteers, members, anyone that can be on the lookout or how to understand how to do threat modeling. We're going to really start combining the two to get a more granular look at our threat landscape. And in your own business, how do I know what a threat is? What do I do with it? And how do I ensure that we are mitigating these and finding how to make corrective actions? And so that'll be the future. We won't be going over that today, but that's just a quick snippet of what to expect in the near future from the Top Threats Working Group itself. So before we begin, I really like to start with statistics in our enterprise space. As security practitioners, we should all love stats and numbers, or at least I would like to think that we do. It's really what drives key performance indicators. And so this is no different when we're discussing on what our focus should be when we discuss security. 95% of cybersecurity breaches are caused by human error. Now, this is no different in this top threats report. We have found over the years that a majority of misconfigurations of threat landscape, of just general security errors, are caused by human error. And when we say human error, what we are really talking about is lack of knowledge on implementing cloud security controls, understanding what risk and mitigating factors there are when considering controls, and overall best security standards and practices to implement in your enterprise space, and how and when to do that. Now, those are all categories of human error. And this is really important because 95%, that is a very large number. And so if we can cut back and begin to educate everyone in the security space or in the enterprise space, whether you're outside of security, because that also plays a role, we can really start to make an impact on what matters and how to implement. So our next stat is 68% of business leaders feel their cybersecurity risks are increasing. Now, this is from Accenture, and this makes complete sense. More than half, we love to see it. Business leaders are starting to take a step forward in identifying the risk associated with their cloud deployments, and not even cloud deployments. It could still be on-prem, and you get a mixture of that hybrid feel. So it's very important that the industry as a whole has noticed that leaders are now taking a step forward in mitigating those risks and finding those risks. And this can come down to, hey, let's generate a risk register. I don't think we've ever actually taken a look at our security posture. Let's identify what drives the business. Let's identify what criticality that has on our monetary value. Is it going to impact us on social media? And taking that a step further. So 68%. For business leaders, that's a very high number because that is outside the scope of security. So we can understand that we're getting eyes on from the outside now. On average, only 5% of companies' folders are properly protected. This is from Varonis, and these statistics are within the last 2 years, so they are very recent, at least for security standards. So when we talk about properly protecting folders, that could be, accompanying with S3 buckets, blob storage, anything in the cloud where your data is going to. Only 5% are actually doing the due diligence to properly secure those folders and the PII that is in those for their employees. And this really feeds back to the identifying risk stage, because if you're not identifying the type of data and identifying how risky that is for your business to have those unsecured, then we're really missing a big point in overall control space. And our last number before we kick off into the overview for the top threats report, and it's probably one everyone is familiar with, data breaches have exposed 36 billion records in the first half of 2020. Now, I would like to raise that through 2021, 2022, this number is probably going to be a heck of a lot more than in previous years because of COVID and because of lockdown and because remote work became so prolific. And that transition in technology that we had to implement during COVID to ensure that people could work from home, that left everything inherently unsecured. Technology was implemented without a security forethought. And so it's really important to understand the amount of data and the amount of records that are being exposed annually, because we can start to see what type of data is being exposed, where it's at, and really start implementing controls, which as we go through the top threats report, just be mindful that this is what breaches have been identified by the general security audience and general security practitioners as their top security breaches that they have seen and that they think are most prolific. And when we combine that with the amount of records that are being spilled out from servers, from cloud storage, we can really start to identify the type of data and start to get a bit of a stronger grasp as we go along. So the purpose of the top threats report. Now, this is the top threats survey report that we will be releasing. There were previous years ones as well. We will be going over the Egregious 11 from 2020. The purpose of this was to identify the last few years, year to year, of major breaches to raise awareness of the threats, the risks, and the vulnerabilities in the cloud enterprise space. And, often not even just the cloud enterprise space, a lot of this can combine to your on-prem solutions as well. If you have managed service providers with a quote unquote, your internal cloud, most of these vulnerabilities across the board are generally the same. So with this top threats report, we want to lay out a list of the top breaches that you've noticed and what companies have seen, and provide the rest of the audience the ability to see that and to see what others are dealing with. Because we're not alone in this. A majority of enterprises deal with the same risks and the same vulnerabilities. It's the ability to manage that and the ability to be given that info on how others are handling that as well. And so the top threats report really drives home what others are doing. And that is a very critical component of the top threats report as a whole. It also provides a mean for logical threat analysis that incorporates mitigation techniques. We do provide in the top threat survey report controls to the CCM that apply, as we'll see, that apply to each breach, and what could be used for mitigating factors. Now, what we will see after I go over the top threats report on the deep dive are the actual mitigations for preventative controls and moving forward on a deeper basis on what it means to, okay, we had a breach in our cloud storage. What mitigating factors can I do, or what controls can I put in place? It's one thing to have the cloud controls matrix, but it's another to see why those controls are protecting those services after finding that you have had a data loss. And there's no limitation to this use. The top threats report, though less granular than the deep dive, it is a piece of information that can be used side by side in your enterprise. If you are not familiar with it, or if you have, take a look at the top threats report and take a look at the breaches that year to year people have been seeing. If you go and take the number 1 breach and just go down the list to number 11, for us, those are the key areas of focus on your enterprise during that current year. So what you can do is use it as a gap analysis. And so if you have misconfigurations, let's say at the number 5 spot, well, maybe I should take a look at misconfigurations in our network. Well, if you don't know what misconfigurations in your network, that probably is alluding to the fact that you should do a scan, take the steps to identify any systems that haven't been patched, that haven't been hardened, and this could be applications in the cloud as well, and really start to build out your gap analysis on what steps to take moving forward. There's no one playbook that tells you how to do this, and so the top threats report can kind of be added to the tool belt of items along with other standards and frameworks to reinforce what you think to business leaders needs to be focused on. And I think that's a big key here, is being able to sell this to your bosses, to the executives that aren't a part of security, and tell them, hey, this is what, Cloud Security Alliance and the enterprise space as a whole has seen. Let's take a look at this and dig in and see what we're doing as far as this goes. So this is how we identify the threats for the survey report. So it's a collaboration of the working group. What we do is we gather a list of about 30 to 40 breach types throughout the last 2 years that we have seen. Now, this can be taken from the previous survey reports. We essentially just dump this to a massive list, and then that list gets published on a official survey from CSA, and we have everyone vote on it. Now, the number could be relevant to 1 through 10, 1 through 12. The number that we end on is usually a percentage gap bigger from the one after it. So we went with 11 this year because the difference between number 11 and 12 was a significant percentage gap, whereas 1 through 11, they were more closely tied together as far as what people assume to be the top breaches that they have seen. This is to identify the main security flaws and appropriately categorizing them. It's one thing to throw out the term breaches. It's one, vulnerabilities. But what the top threats report really does is it aligns and lets people vote on what they're seeing. And that will set a precedent on what to focus on and what has been more critical year to year. And this could be anything they've seen in the media, any, Capital One breach, Disney, Log4j. It could be any of those, but as long as the industry is voting on them, then those will be the most important, and if that makes sense. And so the top threat survey report gives the enterprise a say in what they have seen. So it's allowing inherently volunteers, members, anyone who's taking the survey, giving them a voice really in what they've seen and what they think is important. Oftentimes, we may not think that our thoughts on a vulnerability or a breach are severe, but what this does allow is us to see the actual physical numbers and to make an agreement that that is in fact what has been the most important in the last couple of years. And lastly, this brings together the same ideologies and forecasts and kind of cements everyone's thoughts moving on, right? It really gives us, hey, I did see this and this number was up there, so I must have been thinking about this correctly. And so it kind of just gives everyone an opportunity to understand what they're doing is correct and it's the correct pathway moving forward. So these are the breaches from the Egregious 11 document that we had verified the prior years. Number 1 was data breaches, 2, misconfiguration and inadequate change control, where we go all the way down to number 6, which was insider threat. So for the Egregious 11, typically year to year, insider threat is a bit higher. This year, it was actually below quite a few, and this is for 2020, not this year's. Whereas number 11 was abuse and nefarious use of cloud services. Now, this will be important to remember. I will have another slide to identify what we found this year compared to 2 years ago. So utilizing the findings. So from that previous slide, you saw where the security issue number 1 was in fact data breaches. So in the survey report, once we collect all of the data, we move it into a defining category. So we give a definition to what data breach is, and then we provide business impact to the definition. And now this is meant as a very, very quick glance of what does data breach mean to my company? Well, if we look at number 1, it's an impact to reputation and trust of customers or partners. Now, remember when I was talking about risks and identifying risks? This can feed directly into a risk register from a business impact. If you aren't sure, or you want to put data breach on your risk register and you don't understand how that's impacting you, well, we can now say, hey, this was reputational damage of our customers or partners. So if it's a data breach, what does that mean to our customers? How much money are we going to lose? How much money are they going to lose if a breach happens? And you can feed that into an overall threat modeling and risk overview. And that's just one example of how to feed in the survey report from a day-to-day perspective. If we look at number 3 for business impact, regulatory implications that may result in monetary loss. Now at CSA, we talk about regulatory and compliance. We talk about privacy quite a bit. Well, this helps feed into what regulations you need to focus on, or if it doesn't give you a specific regulation, it at least starts the wheels turning to be like, oh, I actually need to focus on what, in the UK, in North America, or, Asia, we need to actually focus on what compliance regulations we need to fall under now. What is the impact of a data breach? Now, on the right-hand side here, in the survey report, for those familiar, we have CSA security guidance, which is 1 through 16. In prior years, it goes over the main security guidelines or the main domains for cloud security. And you can take a look at the domains assigned for a data breach. So it would have to map to governance and enterprise risk management. It would map to legal issues, compliance, information governance, all the way down to incident response. Data breaches also deal with data security. So the security guidance is meant as a means to be used as an overall view of what to focus on in the cloud security space. It doesn't dive in granular. That's what the CCM controls are for below. Now, if we move below to the CCM controls, every breach that we have identified maps to a specific control plane in the cloud controls matrix. So if you have never taken a look at the cloud controls matrix, it identifies each of the separate domains in different key areas like application and interface security, change control and configuration, over to encryption and key management. Now, the CCM inherently maps to NIST standards, CIS, PCI. It maps to those specific standards in the sections in which you need to focus your findings and what you need to focus on as far as implementation of controls. And it's not meant as a one-stop shop. It's just meant to get things moving in a direction where you can understand what controls need to be in place and then build on top of that, right? One standard probably shouldn't be used across the board, but multiple together can create a more diverse and cemented security posture within your company. Now, if we reference the CCM from that finding, If we take a look at application interface security domain from the CCM, which we saw was one of the CCM domains on the previous slide for data breaches, and we take a look at the specific control ID, we can now use this for an implementation guideline on the right-hand side. Now, this is directly out of the Cloud Controls Matrix version 4, our newest version, which was released. And you can take a look at which step-by-step areas you need to do for implementation. Some example technical metrics, which we provide, our counter percentage of vulnerabilities by weakness, severity, average time to resolution, operational metrics. You can even bring those into play from the CCM implementation guidelines, which would bring in your testing types or applications that are having SAS, DAS scans, counting the percentage of applications that have completed pen testing in the last year. And do you do it yearly? Do you do it semi-annually? And then it's counting proactive engagements by the development and business teams. So as you can see, this is a very general overview of the step-by-step things that others in the industry have looked at, and it might benefit you to implement those long-term. Another part of the CCM that is wonderful is it maps to other security standards which you may be falling under. Like I said, NIST prior or CIS standards from version 3. So if you map to any of those, it will give you a mapping to the direct section on which is applicable. If there's no mapping or if there's a gap, then it means there's no application to it, and you can go ahead and use your other frameworks that you may have found. All right, moving into the deep dive. Now, this is the Top Threats to Cloud Computing Egregious 11 deep dive. This was our 2020 release. The usage spans from architects, engineers, and analysts to any other role that you really would have a need to understand cloud security breaches and mitigation techniques. It also can be used for managers. Hey, if I'm a manager, director, CISO, what do I need to worry about? Why do I need to worry about that? And what is it going to take to even get to the point of mitigating that? Now, the beauty of the deep dive is we went granular and we provided all of the mitigation factors and CCM controls for you. In the deep dive as well, there are the ability to map back to a threat modeling technique, which for us that we're building in the Top Threats group actually maps to MITRE techniques as well. So it's being built out, and it's really just about providing an overview to anyone in the business who needs it. So what we did was we combined the top threats with a granular look at 9 examples of real world attacks and scenarios, which of course are the breaches that have happened in the last 2 years. So we took the top 9 that we think would sufficiently cover the CCM and the top threats, and we built that into this deep dive. It's a means for use in threat comparative analysis, understanding threat vectors and vulnerabilities, and how to mitigate those with mitigation techniques. It really was meant to connect the dots between the top threats when it comes to security analysis, and using those 9 real world threats, we thought it was a very overall broad approach to identifying everything that people would be seeing in the enterprise space, and just a quick playbook on, hey, we saw Amazon had a breach. It was an S3 storage bucket that was insecure. What can I do initially to fix it? And this is kind of that go-to book to see how it was handled. So when you take a look in the deep dive and start actually going in and reading it, this is one of the first pages in there. On the left-hand side, you'll have the Egregious 11. So the EE 1, 2, 3, that is the Egregious 11, 1 through 11 that we had identified in the survey report. Across the top are all of the breaches by case study that went over in this deep dive. So Capital One, Disney Plus, Dow Jones, GitHub, Imperva, Ring, Tesco, Tesla, and Zoom. And this was meant to be a picture of what breach from the Egregious 11 or what tactics were used throughout each breach. So as you can see, Capital One had a majority of the top threat survey report items that were in it, meaning that when we take a look at Capital One, there are probably going to be a few more CCM mitigation factors to consider when taking a look at it. One thing else we also included in the deep dive when taking a look at it was the case study for CCM control coverage frequency. Like I said previously, Capital One had 16 total CCM control domains that it fell under. SEF, IM, HRS, so identity access management. We had our application layer. And then as we go across the board, it's just a look. If you understood the general overview of each of these breaches and you wanted to understand how they were impacted, what was the actual, breach, and what controls could be implemented to resolve that, or what did we think that we could implement to resolve a majority of the reasoning of why these companies were breached. You take a look at the controls, and then we can go through in the actual document itself and see the mitigation techniques. So our first example, Capital One, I believe this was a few years back. The threat actor, of course, a less experienced cloud architect or a less experienced solutions architect. This was an insider threat externally, former CSP trusted insider who had intimate knowledge of AWS operations. So as we go across the board for the threat, we can see that threat fell into data breach. It fell into the category of abuse and nefarious use of cloud services. And then for vulnerabilities, we can go into misconfiguration and inadequate change control. So as you can see in the middle, those are the parts from the Top Threat Survey report from the details on what areas that were impacted and what vulnerabilities identified themselves during the Capital One breach. On the right-hand side, the business impacts bring into play how much financial loss they had. Was it operational? Was there incident response, forensic analysis? Down below in yellow, we go over compliance impacts and reputational. Red, of course, being the worst. They lost a majority of their money. Yellow being next in line for severity. For this, it was sensitive data leakage, which included class action lawsuits and congressional inquiries, as well as a fine from OCC. But a big part of this is seeing what your reputational damage would be, right? If you're a finance company, such as Capital One, maybe smaller, these are still things to take into account. So you lose loss of confidence in your CSP provider, and it could impact long-term stock prices. So if we go back to the threat impact analysis, or just creating a general risk overview for your company, you can start to build from the deep dive on, okay, well, this is how this impacted this company for cloud. Let's take a look if these fit in anywhere into our schema. And on the right-hand side, this is probably the most important part of the deep dive, like I was saying. It has your preventive, detective, and corrective controls, which all stem from the CCM. Now remember, the CCM inherently maps to other frameworks and standards that you may fall under. And so taking those controls and implementing them, you are already being assured that you are aligning to those other controls by way of the mapping itself from the cloud controls matrix. This is then the page following on the deep dive on the actual descriptions and details of the business impacts and preventive and mitigation techniques, detective and corrective. What we did was we went ahead, and instead of just giving you the controls, telling you, hey, good luck, go find it in the CCM, we actually implemented these inside this document internally. And this is where the one-stop shop feel is great for the deep dive document, because you can get very, very familiar and intimate with the cloud controls matrix by number, by category, and see what areas you need to focus on. So if you're a shop that maybe doesn't have detective measures yet, but you can definitely focus on preventive, you can go ahead and read on the cloud controls matrix controls that mapped to those preventative ones. So we have DS1, DSI tag 02, so that's data inventory flows. So it's going to tell you inventory document and maintenance of data flows will identify and establish the secure archiving, destruction, and disposal of aging customer data. Now, as you go through this, it just really helps build that bigger picture on what you need to focus on. So the second item that we will be going over from the deep dive report, since we are limited on time today, is Disney Plus. The threat actor for Disney Plus, of course, was hackers trying to monetize compromised accounts. The threat in this instance from the Egregious 11 document was number 5, which was account hijacking, so exposure and misuse of user accounts for the Disney Plus streaming service. Of course, from there, like I had said previously, we can go through the vulnerabilities and the technical impacts from the Egregious 11 document and how those match together. Whereas you can see, for example, under technical impacts was that data breach, number one again, loss of user credentials and exposure of PII data. Of course, business impacts, again, we have financial, operational, compliance, and reputational. Now, we do have those set as the limited business impact categories. So if you're new to risk, if you're in a risk position at your business, oftentimes if you're a smaller shop, enterprise risk management may have their own set of business impacts that they're potentially detailing or identifying. Well, you can go through this and kind of start adding security side of the house on financial, operational, and of the sorts. And then if we take a look at the controls, this one specifically, Disney Plus had more preventive controls than anything else. Oftentimes, detective can be limited in nature depending on how much money you have towards detective controls. Usually, you will see more of a progressive approach in preventive. All right. Continuing on, apologize, headset just died. Moving on, this is the deep dive continued, where you can take a more granular look. And I want everyone on that's on this meeting or that will be listening to this to go ahead and take a look at the deep dive report. It is a long document, but the details in it are probably better than you would find in any other document of this sort that's at least talking about a breach. It's one thing to talk about a breach, to raise awareness and give the basics. It's another to provide the controls up front on that specific breach. Because if you could align yourself to Disney Plus or relate to that specific type of attack, if you're like, hey, we're utilizing that same service, we have the same business plan, how did this impact them? It is really good to go ahead and take a look at all of these controls that you can take a look at. Now, I added the key takeaway at the bottom of this because in each section, we do have a key takeaway. Now, these can be the main points. If you want to do a quick read through, you don't want to read all of the mitigation techniques right away. Go down to the key takeaways and just take a look at what each of these sections had. So Disney Plus, the first key takeaway, enable MFA to ensure strong user authentication. Easy enough, right? Well, a lot of people don't do that. But this is just one of the strengthening inhibitors to say, okay, let's take a look at MFA again. Number 2, implement different set of login credentials for different services on the same platform. And that's to ensure that there's no lateral movement, right? So anything of a compromise of one account won't affect any of your other services or your other accounts. And that's basic security 101. Again, this isn't done very often, or it's overlooked when we discuss cloud. When you're bringing in new apps, new services, especially if you don't have an identity provider, it's really hard to get a grasp on where all of those roles and the access is coming from. And it's just going to strengthen the fact that, hey, maybe we need to take a look at centralizing our access and our authentication. Like, should we focus on zero trust? Do we even have zero trust? Do we have identity borders? It's just one of the things to take a look at. And the last thing on the Disney Plus key takeaway was user awareness campaign to ensure users follow security best practices. This is nothing new to anyone on this call, but it's not meant to teach new. It's meant to reinforce the idea that, hey, we are seeing these year to year. You need to take a look at these controls and you need to begin the process of implementing them and really start getting the idea that a lot of this is easy. Now, how do we focus and how do we categorize that and sell that to the business? And when you take a look at the deep dive, this is just one of the many ways in which you can use it. It can be good for learning and understanding a breach, or it can be good to reinforce the controls that you would need to implement and or learn and understand yourself. Okay, so I believe this is one of our last slides. This is the new data for this year, which I saw a question come in that has it been released yet? It has not. The release date is RSA in June. That will be our official release as of right now. So we wanted to compare on the left-hand side the new data that we saw in the average score and rank structure. So you could take a look at how these are put out into the wild. And on the right-hand side, I told you on the first slide to keep an eye on those because that is the previous 2020 survey reports items. Now, there were only 5 breaches from the Egregious 11 report that actually fell back onto this one. So as we can see, number 1 for this year is going to be insufficient ID, credential access in key management or privileged accounts. Now, this year's again was 11 because on the 11th spot, the 7th percentile had a major gap to number 12. And so, like I was saying before, that's kind of how these are identified. We take where the breakoff point is for the percentage gap and then include it in the new one. Doesn't always have to be like that. It's really a group consensus. So if anyone is interested in participating in the next year's one, I do suggest coming in and helping out the group, always looking for volunteers. But this just goes to show there was a major change in the space during COVID, during the pandemic, and during remote work. Items changed around quite a bit. The ones that did stay were things like account hijacking. Actually, I think a lot of these were off. Insufficient identity credentials remain the same. But it just goes to show that things had changed so rapidly implementing new technology that a lot of the threat and risk landscape we just weren't identifying properly. And so the new set of risks that we had seen probably were pushed faster and were enabled faster because of how fast we implemented them into remote work. And so that's just something that I wanted to provide everyone on this call and to be on the lookout for the new report. And that is actually my last slide. And any questions now?
Sean, that was great. We've got a couple of questions. So, you answered report has not been released. I mean, the updated one. I pasted the link to the page on the CSA website where people can go get the previous report. There's a webinar as well, and they can sign up to participation to the working group as well. And I'm assuming, Sean, this is going to be the website where, or web page where the new report is also going to kind of go and be replaced. Yeah.
Yes, correct. This will be live next month, fingers crossed, on the CSA webpage. You'll see a lot of social media blast on that one.
Excellent. And Lee is asking question about, you mentioned quite a few organizations, have they actually participated, or is this open source, open intelligence information that you gathered?
Yeah, so a lot of this is from open source intelligence. It's from, actually, we have a lot of volunteers that are in the enterprise space that are familiar with these more often than not. I can't say one way or another if there were anyone from these companies. For that report specifically, I don't believe there were. This new report, there are not that had worked for any of the breach companies as well. So it's all pulled from open source.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And question, and there's one more. Is there underlying threat models that support the details?
So that is something we're looking at combining as far as threat modeling and the details of the actual top threats deep dive report. The threat modeling we most likely use stems from MITRE when it comes to our threat modeling cards that we have. It's a separate item. For this one specifically, there were no underlying threat models.
Okay, perfect. Question from me about, let's say, mapping back into the guidance and into the CCM controls. Is that kind of, are you feeding into those work groups so the guidance is perhaps updated, and CCM as well, based on what is actually happening, in these kind of breaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we take a look at the CCM. It's very active when it comes to updating it. We are constantly having eyes on. We are constantly looking at what controls are working and what isn't. And so when we take a look at the top threats, a lot of our contributors actually are cross-pollinated into both. So we have one of our chairs who actively is in the CCM leadership as well. And so there's always that defining factor of, okay, well, this is a breach we saw. Was this control even applicable? And to go one step further, our enterprise architecture mapping to CCM actually dives into a lot of the more business function controls, if that makes sense. It's actually 15,000 cells of controls. So quite larger than the CCM, but what it does is it actually goes department to department, and you can take more of a managerial approach to it as far as enterprise architecture goes. So they definitely do feed into one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One more question from me is, these big cloud providers, big three, essentially, they've got, some of them they have their own kind of security policies, baselines that the consumers, cloud users can use and get the reporting. Do they take notice of this research and perhaps update their baselines and recommendations or policies? They call it differently, of course, between themselves.
Yeah.
So just about the feedback, whether that's happening or not, and maybe they are participating as well. So if you can cover that.
Yeah, of course. From what I understand or from what I know currently, I have not heard if they have actively used, if any of the cloud providers have actively used the top threats report to go back and take a look at their controls. And, honestly, it's just because it's more of a user on the user side of the house on the shared responsibility model for a lot of these breaches, and not even necessarily the anything wrong with the cloud vendors. But as far as I know, I have not heard that feedback, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. So we don't have any more questions. So I propose that we close the call. It's been great, Sean. Thanks a lot. And we hope the report is released soon. Of course, we will share it with the Cloud Security Alliance UK members as well. And I'm hoping that some of the participants of the chapter will be able to join the working group or at least cooperate on this great work.
Absolutely. We would love to have everyone, always looking for new contributors and subject matter experts. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like to join, and happy to have you.
Excellent. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Vladimir.